I was like, this feels like home to me. I like this. I like these apparatuses. I like this kind of show. I like working with these people. So I kind of stayed in that universe. When you're working on Big Top, the show run is the show run. Like once you've built the tent, the rigging teams are responsible for the show. You're responsible for maintenance of the equipment. I think I would like more people in our industry to be making a living wage without kind of breaking their backs over it.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your access and connection to the live performing arts. In this podcast, you'll hear from some of the industry's most inspiring people from around the globe who create magic on stage and backstage. Our guests share their knowledge, passion, and the real stories of how a show comes together. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your connection to the performing arts. My name is Anna. You can learn more about us on Instagram at StageLync. And today we're talking with Courtney Nichols. With more than 20 years experience in the entertainment industry, she has a rigging background in installation, inspection, project management, and show operations in a variety of entertainment venues. Courtney has been working in contemporary circus since 2009, when she joined creation and then operations of the House of Dancing Water for Dragone. And in 2014, she joined the Cirque du Soleil's touring show division, where she worked on many shows, both arena and big top. Courtney joined Entertainment Project Services in 2022 and serves as head of installations and show support. Hello, welcome to the show.
Hi, Anna.
So happy to have you on. After I read your bio, would you care about introducing yourself in your own words, and how do you end up being a rigger and then doing all things all the way till EPS?
I used to tell people that you just disappoint your parents until you work for a circus that they've heard of. But realistically, I was always involved in theater when I was younger. I performed a lot. And then in high school, I got introduced to the technical side of things. And because I wasn't afraid of heights, I would go on the catwalks. And so I got into lighting. And then when I got more involved in lighting and climbing on things, I eventually ended up working for a production manager named Larry Smallwood, who was like, I think you'd be really great at rigging. He's like, just dispositionally. And so he introduced me to truss and chain motors and kind of sent me on my way there. And I went through that journey with an interest in contemporary circus. I kind of tried to steer my career towards Cirque. And learned about Dragone on the way. And once I started working at Dancing Water, that led to Cirque and then on down the line. So, yeah.
What triggered your interest or change from theater to circus?
I had seen La Nuba in Orlando when I was young and really, really loved that show. And there was a documentary series about the making of Verikai called The Fire Within that I really enjoyed watching, and it seemed so fascinating. And, you know, I think everyone who saw it, the scale of going to see a big top, and in North America, big tops just weren't as common anymore. The artistry involved in the way the show was put together, and the idea that there's this whole like factory making beautiful shows in Canada was interesting. Yeah. So.
And then one day you're at the House of Dancing Water doing creation.
Yeah, which was not a big top.
No.
It was not a big top. And it was interesting because there were a lot of people who had worked for Cirque previously or worked for Dragone at different shows. And it was an international move as well, which was a big change. One of the most impressive pieces of documentation I've ever seen in my life, our original head of carpentry made. And it was a grid that had a photograph of a tool and then flags of a country down the other side, and then where the two things met, what people in that country call this tool. to try and stop screaming matches in the shops all over the building. And like having come up in America, I was soundly in the imperial system, and dancing water was soundly metric. And everyone who wasn't American was very quick to explain to you why metric is better. And they're right. But so it was a big move. It was a different scale of show than I'd worked on before. It was a water show, which just adds all sorts of things. And you would think working up, on the fly levels, on level 4, on level 6, on level 8, you stay dry, but it sticks to the artists, and they love to get people wet when they come back from a flight. So you're wet all the time, your equipment's wet all the time, and that introduces a lot of challenges in handling the equipment. And then the way that shows like that operated. I'm working with Anna Robb, who was our stage manager for the build of that show. It was incredible to see the breadth and scope of information that she was processing, and being able to go to her and be like, I have this one thing going on over here. And could you give me a heads up when that's happening? And she was able to incorporate it all in. And it made this incredible show that ran smoothly. So it was a massive learning curve. And there were some people who came over who had been at my level previously and didn't like it. And it wasn't for them, but I was like, this feels like home to me. I like this. I like these apparatuses. I like this kind of show. I like working with these people. So I kind of stayed in that universe. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't a big tub, but it was a big show.
It was a big show. Yeah.
And I'm sure it was the learning curve, it was for everyone. I am pretty sure no matter who you were and how do you end up there was a learning curve.
Yeah. I think so too. I think anybody, who walked into that building and said, oh, I totally grasp everything that's going on, there's nothing to learn here. They were kidding themselves. But it was a great place to work, and I got to meet some really fascinating people from all over the world, which I think has kind of changed my perception of everything for the better. But yeah, dancing water was definitely a gateway drug for contemporary circus and for that working environment, and got me one step closer to the Cirque du Soleil world, because I always thought, I'll never be able to work there because it's so fancy and it's so all of these things. But the more I got to know people who had worked there previously or were going back to jobs there, the opportunity came along. And so I hopped on.
And you got to work on big tops.
And I did get to work on big tops. I mean, oddly, the opportunity that came along came from a friend who I'd had from when I worked at a museum in the States. And he and I had gone separate paths, and he had ended up at Cirque and I'd ended up at Dragone. And then he was like, oh, we've got an opening. You should apply. And it was a great gig. And big top specifically because the big top itself, the structure is so magical. I've always felt like when you go into a theater, any theater, it's a special space. And, people make art for you, and people go there to celebrate things, and tickets to the theater are a big deal. Going to see a show is a big deal. But big tops are such kind of rare animals, and people come to watch you put it together. And then when they come inside, they're in this quiet space that's designed only for this little stage. And it's a really, really lovely place to come to work every day, for sure.
What about working in arenas? Did you, was there a lot of difference going from one to the other? I think you have a preference, but I don't know, maybe.
You know what? I physically don't know if I could do arena again. The move to arena, I wanted to try a new thing and try a different thing. And for me, it was an opportunity to do creation on a new project with Cirque and be part of the creation rigging team, which I jumped at, be at headquarters in that sacred space that I'd seen when I was a kid, where people are making this incredible art and doing such cool things. And I'm glad I did it. When you're working on big top, the show run is the show run. Like once you've built the tent, the rigging teams are not huge on most of the shows, 5, 6 people or less. And you're responsible for the show. You're responsible for maintenance of the equipment, for inspections of the equipment. So your schedule is like pretty regular as the weeks go on. And if your team is fully staffed, maybe you get a night off a week, or maybe you get a show off at some point during the week, and you get to really live in the city that you're in. And then you get to transfer. And transfer is you do your shows, and then immediately that night you start taking out the equipment. And for rigging, a lot of times that's during the show. As things are coming off stage, you're packing them into cases, and up in the grid, they're packing things into the grid. And then you're there that night for the first phase of teardown, which a lot of times can be the riggers in the grid disconnecting the grid from the structure of the tent and getting it ready to lower in the next morning and put on the ground because the carpenters have gotten rid of the stage. Every show's a little different, but the pacing is different and it's intense. And when you're in transfer, as soon as you stop moving your equipment, your show equipment, you jump in with, in the rigging department, the tents team, and you are rolling canvas, you are driving forklifts, you are operating a turfer, you're doing all of these things to take apart the structure. And then once that's done and packed up, everybody has a beer, you go back and shower, you go to the next city, and you get up in the morning and you build the tent again. So it's this kind of marathon of energy. But then your reward is that you get several weeks where you get to live in a town and be a part of the show. And we would do events. We would do events where we'd, welcome kids, different groups into the tent, and we would have special events for them. People traveled with their families. So it was a very family oriented environment. And it was just kind of, you lived there. You didn't have another house that you went to because you lived on the road. It was a life. Arena is a different animal, and it's a fun animal. It's how do we shave 4 minutes on what we did off of what we did 3 days ago, which is a great game to play, right? I was with Taruk, which was a pretty
And they
big
had
show.
they have this like gantry master grid of sorts.
Yeah, it was, it would have been almost better if it was a mother grid, I guess, but it was just so much truss, so many motor points. And, and we had a 3D flying system. The whole show was basically the size of an Olympic hockey rink, right? We took up the whole arena floor. And we actually split it into 2 departments, into arena rigging and acrobatic rigging, because there was so much rigging burden on this show that it was separated out. So we had 6 when we were fully staffed. We had 5 rigging positions in the show for the acrobatic riggers. And then we had 2 full-time arena riggers. And, you'd show up and you'd help with markup, and then motors start flying off the truck. And you're, which size motor do I have? Get it to the right place to the local ground riggers. In the meantime, carpentry is building a floor up from downstage. So as they start covering chalk marks, you're moving chalk marks to the floor that they've covered and popping your chain motor up there so that you can chase after each other. And you're in there all day long. We're setting up trusses, we're reeving lines through trusses that have carriers. And that would be a long day. Then we come in the next day, we do validations all day long, and then shows that night, shows for the rest of the week. Sunday, we do 2 shows, and then we tear it all down, put it back on the trucks, have a shower in the basement of the arena, grab what is inevitably a Jimmy John's sub or pizza, and probably get on the bus to the next town. Very occasionally, we would take a chartered flight, which was fancy. But a lot of times you get on the bus to the next town, you get to your hotel between 3 and 5 in the morning, you unload everybody's luggage, and then that's your day off. So the number of times that I was like, I gotta leave the hotel, and then I would leave for a couple hours and walk around this town, and by the time I got back, I couldn't remember my hotel room number because I'd only been in it for 2 hours. It was a frequent occurrence for a lot of us. So you don't really get to experience a town in the same way you do on Big Top. And we were 1 week sit downs, which a lot of places were a lot of shows were much shorter sit downs than we had, but we had a full week. There were things about both of them that were great. But yeah, arena, when I think back to it right this minute, sounds so exhausting to me. But we would do that. We would say, like, last week we got this much time for our out, and we think we can trim it by 4 minutes, and we get that case here and this case over there. And it becomes kind of a dance with your coworkers. And it's a different but fun experience.
And you've done both with Cirque and with Dragone. Seems to me that you've done the transition from creation to operation, which is two different rhythms as well.
It is. It's two different rhythms. And in my mind now, even though a show has opened, it is still a year away from being in operations, because inevitably, like, you are sprinting to that opening night and you get there. And one thing that I've observed, especially with casts, like, everyone's really excited to be part of a creation team, and they're like, I can land a triple 8 shows a week every time, no problem. And then you get 6 weeks on the road and they're like, what if it's a double? It's like, what if it is a double? If that's what your body wants to do for, so you work out ways where people were like so overjoyed and enamored with the idea of creation that they push themselves really hard. And then the artists kind of settle into, not settle, they still do incredibly spectacular things, but like they find a thing like, where can my body be the safest for the whole time? And we do the same thing with technical, like, where can we create efficiencies or safeties, or what else can we do to kind of refine this project? And then artistically, I can't think of a show right now that has opened, gone out on the road, and then not been under artistic revision for at least a year, because you get to that final moment and then you go, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we tweaked this, or we did that right there, or like, we've got this other guy who can do that thing and I think it would look nice over there. And then it gets adjusted. And so everybody down the line, rigging and everyone else, tweaks their system to accommodate the change. And yeah, that I've found a lot that there's the people who do creations and there's the people who do operations. And there's some people who do both, but it's a different mentality. Sometimes people want to be there every day to do their show track and land it every time. And some people are like, I'm going to be bored with that. And so I'd rather just build a new show. And, the options exist for everybody.
I've heard this a number of times and asked as a question directed to myself. So, are you a creation person or are you an operation person? And I think I've said it on the podcast before, but I truly believe there's a third person, which is the one that does that transition from creation to operation. It's this year that you're talking about that it takes a little bit of, there's a lot of people from creation that are living. These people are likely not going to stay very long, but they're going to make this transition of, okay, this was the goal, this was done like this, but we can optimize it like so. And then eventually it makes its way to the people that are going to run that show for 5 years, 10 years, or a number of times. I do think there's that third person that might be the people that do both, that do creation, do operation, and do the transition.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that there's another kind of middle skill set in there that is the documentationalists who are like making the as-built, right? Haven't we all been to a venue where it's like, this is this big, and then you get there and it's this big? Well, who did the as-built? No one, because everyone was so exhausted when they were done with creation. And also, they didn't care anymore because they had figured out a way around the fact that this is only this big. And these people learned it from those people who were like, don't worry about it, it's fine. But the person in the middle who really gets the show in line, gets the show tracks documented, like, really make sure that you have all the information you need to move forward. That's third person. I agree.
But yeah, I believe that person, yeah, because like when you're doing creation, and in my case, I've done my possible best to deliver final documentation, and it's only final for that opening night, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe if it's talking scenery, it might be the final, maybe, hopefully. But if you're talking a show track, that's going to change a whole lot during that first year. And it will keep evolving, right? It's a living document. But yeah, I do think those that are in the middle, making that translation and transition, I don't know. I just think, yeah.
It's an important part of it. I kind of think that every I think that every team kind of needs that person, like if they can afford that person all the way along, because when that person drops off, sometimes a team doesn't have somebody who's paying attention to that level of documentation or changes or updates, or, shows get older and acts change and technology changes and safety standards change. And so sometimes there's just something that is different for another reason, but it doesn't necessarily get documented. So, yeah.
Right, like we did this way for so long because in creation there was something that made it be so, but we no longer have this part, so we may not need this element anymore, or this cue, or this person in this position. But yeah, it takes someone that understands that process that maybe didn't do the entire creation, but can get a good rundown from the creation team and then pass it on so that they can adjust. But yeah, my my 2 cents on that third person that I think we should maybe start thinking of more often.
The more that we're discussing this, the more I really think that that should just be an all the time person for a show, though, like the post creation person who's kind of keeping it alive. Because there's a lot of shows I've seen that are older who they lost that middle person, and you end up having to call somebody out of retirement to be like, nobody knows where this rope runs. Can you come out here?
Well, that's where documentation comes in also. But and then the AD really plays that role to a big extent. Like they might not understand why a technical cue or process is done so, but he understands the ethos of the show, and maybe that gives some light on why a technical part is the way it is.
That's fair.
Anyhow.
I'm guessing that we are two people who've done a lot of documentation. So
Yeah, documentation that deserves its own podcast on its own, and it can be boring, but it's so important.
it can be, but when people like it and they refer to it, it's the best feeling in the world.
And now, a note from our sponsor. The StageLync podcast is proud to be sponsored by Clearcom. Clearcom is the leader in voice communications for theater and the performing arts. Call your cues with the simplicity and elegance of Clearcom intercom solutions. You can find them at clearcom.com. Go check them out.
Right. Because when you're in operation and you're like, how do I do this or why? And then you have something.
Yeah.
Speaking of, that leads to leading teams and structuring, and you've had the chance to lead a number of teams, and you're leading one right now. So how is it?
I think it's a little bit of a different thing depending on where you're at. The first time that I was a head of department was for Taruk, actually. And that was definitely we came out of creation and we lost some staff members pretty quick. Like it just wasn't for them, which no harm, no foul. We used to have every time that someone came in on a temporary contract while we were trying to hire people or get them in, we would draw a stick figure on the side of the road case and then cross it off when they left. We had 27 people in the first 18 months that show was on the road on a 6-person team. And it was just because we would get like a temporary person in while we were hiring. And then, everyone was short staffed. And so that was an experience in just trying to keep my head above water and really holding out for a team that I felt like ticked all the boxes of what we wanted in that group of people. And to this day, it is one of my favorite teams for sure, because I'm a big believer in I don't have to know everything. I just have to make sure I'm working with people who are better at things than I am. And then let's pool all that knowledge. So, you get someone in there who's really, really into rescue stuff and gadgets. And they have all of the latest Petzl gear, but also cool mountain climbing stuff from Europe that they can't use for the show, but is interesting to talk to and interact with and like see how it can be useful to us. And those people really love doing the minutia of updating rescue documentation and making sure we stay on a schedule for that. And they can take that off your plate, or they can run with it. And, people who are really, really organized documentation people and into the show tracks who can capture the minutia of a show track and teach a show track the way it's supposed to be done, not the way that I'm kind of doing it these days, because things get wishy-washy when that happens. So someone who's really good at maintaining the path that was set from the beginning, great. You can be our person who trains new people who come in. You're in charge of knowing all the show tracks, 10,000 points. You get someone who's a great number two, someone who you don't have to worry about. If you wake up sick in the morning, you can be sick that morning, and that's okay. I think always having a number two who is smarter than you and can replace you very easily is the way to go, right? Who you can communicate very clearly with and very directly with about what's going on in the department, so that if you get hit by a bus, there is no stopgap for the department. They pour a beer out in the parking lot and they go on with the day, and the show is not missed. And a builder, like in Circus, we were talking before about rope splicing, and we do less sewing now. When I first went to Dancing Water, we were sewing our own straps and hand loops. But liability and also specialty wise, like you have other people do it. The splicing we still do a lot of on the road, and having a person who is a really solid rope splicer who's really into making it precisely, tracking the dates that stuff goes in. And then you don't have to do that. You just have to make sure that they're taking care of it. So my approach with that team was to really hold out and see if I could find the people who I felt like we needed for that team. And we ended up with a group of people who we like to work together. We like to play together, which was great in an arena environment. And when we were short-staffed, we stayed and helped each other out with projects. So that was kind of a great introduction to department management. The add-on side of it was I did a temporary, during a tour break for Turok, I did a temporary coverage for department head on OVO. And they were going through the process of doing their budgets. And the company manager there gave us a budget document that I am not ashamed to say that I stole, and is the best budget document I've ever seen in my life. And I brought
Haven't we all stolen documentation though?
I'm not sad about it. I tell everybody. And it was the best. It was so good. And it was really focused on the way that Cirque processes finances for their departments. And I brought it back to Turok. And, people there were like, this is really great. And I was like, I stole it. Do you want it? And so that was a whole learning curve as well, because the rigging department, it's expensive equipment. The acrobatic equipment and the fall protection equipment is expensive. And even on that show where I wasn't responsible for the budgets to do with the chain motors and the arena rigging, it was a lot of money to manage. And I definitely spent a fair amount of time being like, who put me in charge of all this stuff? But yeah, it was an excellent learning curve. And when I left there, I was asked by Fred Caron, who used to be the head of rigging for Toric Show Division, if I could go and help out a little bit on Kuza, because they had a brand new head and they just lost a head and they were short staffed. And I was like, I'd love to, but I've never been a head on a big top, and I haven't been on a big top for years at this point. And so I went over there and kind of worked with, it's kind of a Gilligan's Island situation. I was supposed to go for, I think, 3 months, just do one city. And I ended up there for 6 or 8. It's all run together now. But just trying to get that show all set up so they have the things they need, and that the new head was ready to go, and then, take some time off. And for a little while after that, Fred would call me and be like, hey, can you go? This person is going on a paternity leave. And, can you come over and cover department head here? And in those situations, when you're there for, 3 or 4 months at a time, or sometimes longer, you're just trying to drive the boats straight, right? Run it the way that they ran it, so that when they come back, everything is how they left it. Yeah. And I got to close Amaluna for that reason. A lot of people went to new shows because Amaluna was closing. They took other opportunities. And so I ended up on Amaluna for the last several months of its life, which was a really interesting process. I hadn't closed down a show before, and it's a lot of history. I definitely was going through the hard drive, like what is important for us to archive and finding like old head of departments taxes. Um, it was like, hey, do you need these? I know you're over on the show now, but I'm going to delete them. I don't think it's important. Or like going through drawers. And when a show gets that old, like you have the original documentation, it's great. But there have been so many heads of department in the meantime. So you go into a drawer and be like, what is this thing? And everyone's like, I don't know what the thing is, but it's always been in the drawer. And I'm like, I'm gonna throw this away now. Like it doesn't have scenic paint on it. It might be like broken packaging for all we know. Um, yeah. So being a department head was, in the context of shows, a really interesting learning experience, right? Because every show is different. Every show has a different expectation of their heads, and they're operated a little bit differently depending on who the technical director is. Um, and so going in and in a lot of the shows, kind of trying to just keep it close to where the head who was coming back had set it up. It was a pretty challenging experience. And then you have funny things like while I was on to Rook and we were on tour break and I was covering on OVO for a little while, we only had 2 female heads of rigging at Cirque, and I was both of them, which I think has changed now. I think they've got a couple or at least 1 female head of rigging on the road. But for a long time, it was just me. So that was something that would come up in conversation. Just because it was a different thing. I think that there had been 1 woman who was a head of rigging for touring show division before me. It was never a big deal, but it was definitely something that was regularly acknowledged as well. I think
Was it meaningful for to you?
In a joking way, like I think yes is the answer, really. Like I think that was kind of a special thing. But I also like to think that it's meaningful for anybody to be in charge of a team of people, and to be in charge of a team of people who are responsible for the safety of a whole nother group of people is a meaningful thing, gender aside. I think I've been pretty lucky in that I haven't had tons of, but you're a girl in my older career. From time to time, people are still going to people, and there's nothing to do about that. But I don't know if it was meaningful to me because there weren't a lot of other women there, or just because I had really wanted to work for this company for a long time. And then one day I got to be a department head, and that was a pretty big deal.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's like a little kid dream come true.
A little bit. Yeah.
And then after all this work with Cirque and Dragone and more in the creation operation side, now you're more into show support, which is something that we don't talk much. I think especially in Cirque, because everything is in-house, and many other productions either build everything in-house or own totally the equipment. It's not something that happens a lot, but maybe smaller theaters do, smaller productions. When you rent out equipment, when you acquire something specific, there's this show support idea that's there, and that's what you're doing now.
Yeah. There was, 2020 happened. I talked about getting to put Amaluna to bed, which we were originally going to close Amaluna in Hong Kong. And then it was March of 2020, and the Yellow Umbrella riots were happening, and they decided it wasn't safe for us to go over. So they decided that we would stay in Sacramento, and we would close in Sacramento. And people came who had worked on the show years before and opened it, and it was a really kind of beautiful thing. Yeah, so we were closing the show in Sacramento, and it was March of 2020, and on March 7th, we closed the last container and had a beer in the parking lot and mused over what was going on. And I had gotten a call from Fred several weeks before saying, hey, Kuza needs a head temporarily. They're having staffing, stuff. Can you come over? And that was a show that I had been on for a while previously. And I was like, I'd absolutely love to. And with the way their schedule worked, I basically we closed on Luna, had the beer, went and took a shower, grabbed my bags, got on an airplane that night, and flew to Spain. And by the time I landed in Spain, it was tear down. And so they were doing their last shows and equipment was getting packed up. And I met the company manager and he said, I'm not positive we're going to the next city. And I was like, cool, let me know what I need to do. No problem. I was supposed to stay with them in Lyon and then go to Tel Aviv. And then we were going to switch infrastructure, which is, you could do a whole podcast on moving a show from one big top to another big top. Because even though there are sister big tops and they're supposed to all have the same structures, inevitably they don't. So fitting it into another big top is always an issue. But that was all going to be there and then I was going to leave. And he's like, I'm not sure if we're going to Lyon. I'm like, okay. We were all just waiting to see what happened with this COVID thing, right? Just like everybody else. Yeah, so went to Spain and, over the course of the next couple of days, while we got all the show equipment out and the bleachers out, it went from we're going to go to Lyon to we won't go to Lyon. We're going to go straight to Tel Aviv. And then it was, we're not going to do the run in Tel Aviv. We're going to go to the other infrastructure. And so instead of just taking the show equipment out, we detached all of the show critical equipment from this existing structure so we could leave that tent behind. And, stood in a parking lot and thought, man, this is probably the last time I'm ever going to be in a big top. Like, who knows what the world is going to do. Right.
Oh, wow. That's such an intense feeling.
It was weird and it was happening all over the place. Shows were shutting down or some of them didn't get a chance to take down their own big top. And I think that was a little bit cathartic for that team to be able to take their equipment apart. I reached out to the technical director on Totem because I had started my career at Cirque with Totem and they were in Germany while we were in Spain. I was like, do you need help getting your tent down? And they're like, we do, but we're trying to figure out the logistics because they just said they were closing borders. So when the pandemic happened and I came back to the States, a very close friend I ended up staying with for the whole pandemic. And then by the time things relaunched again, everyone's lives had changed a little bit. And I decided that I wanted to maybe be in a place. And as hard as I had fought against it, maybe that place was Las Vegas, which is great. Actually, everyone kept telling me this is a great place, but I would come visit and be like, no, it's terrible and it's hot. But when you live here, it's actually a really great place.
That's what everyone says, and I can't speak against that. I do have some positive feelings towards being in Vegas.
I'm kicking and screaming, but once I got here, I was like, oh no, wait, this is actually pretty great. So yeah, I made the move down here, and I was looking for a change in Vegas, and my friend Eric Rouse reached out and said, hey, we're looking for someone at EPS, and so I joined up over there, and it was kind of a throwback to my earlier career doing installations, but there's also a lot of show equipment, acrobatic equipment, inspection. It's a pretty broad plate that we take on, and so I'm able to kind of bring in some of my career working in contemporary circus and some of my earlier career working in museums and working on larger installations or theater-specific installations. And do some training too, which is pretty great. So far, so good. So the show support side of things, and the show support side of what we do is, everyone has been hiring things since the pandemic. But as we were discussing earlier, that third person being able to come in and be like, here's the continuity, or being able to call someone up and be like, we need to know how this works, or we have new people here and we need them trained. We can kind of fill that gap for companies. You need training so that people can do this properly, or you have this unusual thing and you need us to help you develop a training program. No problem. We can do that. You need quarterly inspections of something. We can set up that program for you. We can do that for you. We can train your people to do it. And I think a lot of that show support mentality comes out of the years spent on shows. I'm like, man, what would I like to have had from a company that I wish I could have called to take care of this for me or take care of that for me? And I went out on one of the big top shows to do the annual competent person inspection on their fall protection. And technically that can fall under the purview of the head of the show, depending on what show it is and what their needs are. that can be a department head responsibility, but also it takes forever to go through all the fall protection equipment on a show and go through each piece and catalog it and inspect it and like do all of those things. And so being a third party who can come in and understands what you're using it for and all of that stuff is pretty valuable. So I think that the experience in show has really kind of fed positively into going into a show support role. What do you need? What can we do for you? We can take care of that. No problem.
I'm not going to go back to that, but we quickly touched on the museums, or you did. And I think that's pretty cool in a universe that it's usually put apart, but it's also very close, especially technically wise, and all the scenic ideas of it, and even lights and sound, how we lay out a space. So,
yeah.
Was it a good experience?
It was an incredible experience. I worked at Mass MoCA, and the production manager there, his name is Larry Smallwood, and he's just one of those people who's so smart that you're like, it's a little terrifying to be in a room with you. But he had come up a lot in New York and, done windows at Bergdorf's and Macy's and gallery lighting and a lot of other things. And the museum had several theaters on site as well. A big black box theater that was all chain motor and truss, and a couple of outdoor venues. There was an outdoor movie theater. So we got to learn about projection from the friendly old projectionist while I worked there. And we would build a concert stage outdoors in the summer. And it was a lot of versatile theater spaces. But through that, I was able to help out in the galleries when gallery changeover was going on. So learn about gallery lighting and, foot candles and art handling and all of those things. I had taken some time off from college. I got an internship at Mass MoCA, and then it turned into a job. And so when I left Mass MoCA, I went back to college, and it was interesting to be in a class and have people be like, oh, Robert Wilson, this guy. And I was like, I remember Robert Wilson when he came and installed, stations.
That's awesome.
Right? Like there were these weird moments. And I mean, to be quite honest, I didn't finish my degree until 2020 when no one had anything better to do. And by the time that happened in those Zoom calls, no one else on the Zoom call except the professor had been born when I started college. But I had a professor who said something about Mabu Mines, and I was like, oh, I remember meeting those guys. They were lovely. And it turns out that he had been shadowing Lee Brewer from Mabu Mines when they were at the museum in residency building a show, and he had written a book about it. So I was like, I'm going to buy your book because
that's cool. Yeah.
So the museum was not just an opportunity to learn about really incredible art and meet really incredible people from the art world, but also kind of the overlap with theater and kind of avant-garde theater out of New York. And they also did a lot of local outreach in the community. We would have programs with kids who were in different kind of support programs around town as well. And it's an incredible place. There was a movie, I think, that they made about it a couple years ago called Museum Town. I want to say it went to Sundance, but yeah, it was an incredible experience. And then that fed into when I lived in DC, the opportunity to work in places like the Smithsonian when they were doing lighting changeovers. The communities are all very small, right? So suddenly you get to be in a room above the big whale in the Ocean Hall at the Natural History Museum, and that's super cool. And also we installed, as art for the museums got more technological, we're installing self-climbing lighting battens, and we're installing, motorized systems in museums. And because I had the experience in talking and kind of interacting with museum people, it makes the interaction easier, right? Because the worlds are different, even if a lot of the equipment is the same. The worlds are different enough that people can be wary of like someone's coming in to do something in my space. But when you're like, oh no, this will be just like the time that we did this thing over here, and then we can do that. And it sort of allows for a transition. So yeah, it was it was a very cool experience. I definitely would not get Massimoka is a great place.
So just to wrap up and not to dig further down in another rabbit hole, but what would you say is your favorite thing about your job?
My favorite thing about my job, like overall ever,
Yeah, either you can choose.
it's hard to beat a big top. It's hard to beat a big top. It's a pretty magical place. But I don't know, I like working on shows. I like when people feel comfortable and they feel confident with their equipment or with the people who are supporting them, you know. If you need 3 fist bumps before you get on your trapeze, then I got 3 fist bumps for you. That's all right. Cool. Let's do that. That's easy, you know. And the number of times I've been like, if yelling at me is helping, then yeah, let's do that. Okay. Are we done? All right. Like, you know, that I think is the best part. But if we're talking just things, I do really love a big top.
But yeah, no, it was more. Well, we got two answers for one question. I like that. Okay, so next one, contrary, would be if you could change something either about your job or the industry, what would you change?
My kind of stocks answer from a few years ago is already changing. Like we talked earlier about being a woman as a department head and, you know, what that is. And I see more women in the industry now who have much less tolerance for. I definitely came up in a generation that it was like you kind of just got to be one of the boys, and that's what it is. And there's a lot less of that now from the young women that I meet, and that is, I think that's kind of lovely. So that's already changing. I think I would like more people in our industry to be making a living wage without kind of breaking their backs over it. And I think there's a lot better odds post pandemic. I think a lot of people decided whether or not they wanted to come back and have to, you know, gig 80, 90 hours a week. But I think I'd like to see kind of less of people fussing about the price of a concert ticket and more of them understanding that it's a lot of people hustling to get that done and they deserve to make a living wage and to have health insurance and, you know, all of those things. I would like for our industry to get better at that, but it requires everyone's help.
Yeah, it's not only about the ticket price, right? That's the big scope and making sure everyone's got what they need.
Yeah.
Courtney, thank you so much for being here with me or with StageLync tonight. And thanks for your time and sharing all this. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad we got to talk.
Yeah, same.
Or at least I did.
And to all of our audience, thanks for listening all the way here. And make sure you check out our website at stagelync.com and our social media. Thank you.